Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'd like to talk a bit about NESARA, the National Economic Security and Recovery Act. NESARA. I've been hearing and seeing a ton about this lately, and I thought I would dive in and see what the fuss was all about, and I'm glad I did. Now, I've watched a lot of videos on this, but they didn't go into much detail. It seems as though every video was just an overview. So, as this channel always does, we will dig down into it. The National Economic Security and Recovery Act was a set of proposed economic reforms for the United States suggested during the 1990s by Harvey Francis Barnard. Now, Harvey was a very intelligent man, and he wore many hats. He was known as a problem solver, a thinker. From Wikipedia, Harvey Francis Barnard, 1941 to 2005, an LSU graduate in systems philosophy and an engineering consultant and teacher, created the NESARA proposal during the late 1980s and early 1990s. He printed 1,000 copies of his proposal, ladies and gentlemen. Now listen to this very closely. He printed 1,000 copies entitled Draining the Swamp, Monetary and Fiscal Policy Reform, 1996. And he sent copies to members of Congress. Yes, folks, it's called Draining the Swamp. And I find it interesting that the president made that phrase sort of his secondary non-official campaign slogan. Like anyone with half a brain, Barnard believed that this proposal would pass quickly based on its merit. But I think he underestimated the power of the ancient Babylon secret societies and their control over the U.S. media and its government. Barnard claimed that the proposals, which included replacing the income tax with the national sales tax, abolishing compound interest on secured loans, and returning to a bimetallic currency, would result in zero inflation and a more stable economy. And I believe he was correct about this. But as you would imagine, the proposals were never introduced before Congress. Folks, I use Wikipedia for basic broad information like birth dates and places of birth, etc. Even employment history, because it's a decent source for those things. The next note about NESARA on Wiki smells of diseased, deceptive opinion. And in fact, Wiki uses a slur to describe someone. And here is the paragraph. NESARA has since become better known as the subject of a cult-like conspiracy theory promoted by Shana Candace Goodwin. And let's stop right there. There's that word, dear listeners, conspiracy theory. And there's that other word that they have evolved into using because it reinforces the first one and can be used when the first slur, conspiracy theorist, gets a little tired. And that is cult. And I don't have to go over the CIA introduction of the phrase conspiracy theory into the social lexicon, as most of you know how and why that word became the go-to word for situations that must be discredited by the cabal. Now, I don't know if Miss Goodwin was a cultist, a cult leader, or a conspiracy theorist, and she might be. But I get really, really suspicious when establishment sources move to use those descriptions of a person or organization. And when I do see it, I tend to immediately reject it. I believe that if someone is attempting to give information on something and that info is wrong or deceptive, then I believe the things that are wrong or deceptive should be pointed out. This would allow for those derogatory CIA-made phrases to never make it into the conversation, as they are basically broad insults intended to attack the messenger rather than attacking the message, and in many cases they also use these phrases to attack the message itself. Now, Miss Goodwin was a student of the Ramtha School of Enlightenment, which seems somewhat culty. But hell, I was a 33rd degree Freemason, so I'm not in any position to judge someone who happens to be in an organization that seems somewhat culty. Soon after Barnard released NESARA on the internet, a user known as Dove of Oneness, later identified as Miss Goodwin, began posting about it in internet forums. According to Goodwin's website, the NESARA bill languished in Congress before finally being passed by a secret session in March 2000 and signed by President Bill Clinton. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop right there. I can find nothing whatsoever on this bill, quote unquote, languishing in Congress, let alone of its passing. And let me ask every one of you out there who may be listening to this presentation, why would Bill Clinton ever sign this into law? Once we get into what NESARA will do, it will be very clear that Bill Clinton would not have passed this bill, as it would be his death sentence. I'm not sure which claim is more unbelievable, that the bill went through Congress and was passed but in total secrecy, or that Bill Clinton would ever consider signing this bill. Both seem very far-fetched to me. It is claimed that the new law was to be implemented at 10 a.m. on September 11th, 2001, but that the computers and data of the beneficiaries of the trillions of dollars of prosperity funds were destroyed on the second floor of one of the World Trade Center towers in New York City during the terrorist attacks. Supposedly, an earlier gag order issued by the Supreme Court had prohibited any official or private source from discussing it under penalty of death. I suppose all of that could be plausible, but I think it's all highly unlikely. Goodwin referred to white knights, most of them high-ranking military officials who have since been struggling to have the law implemented despite opposition by George W. Bush. This is very plausible. There are many good patriots out there working. We call them the Alliance. Goodwin allegedly believes and purports that Bush orchestrated the September 11th attacks and the Iraq War as distractions from NESARA. Now, they claim that Bill Clinton signed the bill into law in March of 2000 and to take effect 9/11/01. Ladies and gentlemen, if this is all true, then this gave the cabal 18 months to plan and implement the 9/11 attacks. I believe that this isn't nearly enough time to do all of what was needed to be done to implement those attacks. I can't buy this theory. Goodwin often claimed that Bush officials were attempting to hack into and bring down her website to prevent her from publicizing the law. And ladies and gentlemen, if Bush and of course the CIA were attempting to hack Miss Goodwin's website, I'm wholeheartedly sure that they could have easily done so and could have done without Miss Goodwin even suspecting a thing. That comment by her is silly and continues to make her and her story very suspect, at least to me, and at least certain parts of her story, let me put it that way. I have a link for you all to the proposal, so let's go ahead and go over it. Broadly, it is charged with monetary policy reform and fiscal policy reform. To go somewhat more in depth, it does all of these things. It terminates or drastically reduces existing mortgage debt, provides new banking rules that are equitable to all. It eliminates federal income taxes, enables single parents to support their families again. Do you remember those days? I do. Restores financial privacy, restores inner cities as vital economic areas, improves the balance of trade, restores high-paying, productive jobs, increases benefits to seniors, doubles the average standard of living, eliminates bank failures, provides $500 billion for infrastructure projects, and I assume that this is 1990s dollars, so this number is likely to be at least double today if I'm not mistaken. It makes the public responsible for currency creation. Imagine that. It eliminates $1 trillion of public debt and I'd assume that this is also higher in today's world. It eliminates inflation. It benefits Americans with an unprecedented economic boom. It provides a more secure future for all. Now, ladies and gentlemen, how does NESARA intend to do all of these things that I've just referenced? Well, first, it provides monetary reform by amending the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. You know, the act that the signers met on Christmas Eve on Jekyll Island and passed it in darkness in order to, quote, stabilize the American and world economies, to eliminate big boom or bust cycles, or should I say to control big boom or bust cycles, and to promote peace and prosperity through the whole world as we now would have economic peace, they said. For some reason, after this act was implemented, the world saw World War I break out almost immediately after its signing, then a great worldwide depression, followed by a Second World War, a Korean conflict, a Vietnamese conflict, a savings and loan and banking crash, 3 Middle Eastern wars, and a full crash of the U.S. economic system again in 2008. All things that this act promised to prevent. But I digress. The act would provide fiscal reform by amending the Internal Revenue Code of 1939. The act that I'm reading, dated 1998, talks of many of the problems facing America at that time, and most of these things are still main issues facing our country today. The income gap between rich and poor continues to widen. Earnings for the poorest fifth of American families rose less than 1% between 1988 and 1998. Earnings for the richest fifth of American families rose more than 15% between 1988 and 1998. And folks, this number has skyrocketed exponentially since then. That 15% over 10 years is most likely 35 or 40% from 2010 to 2020. I'll bet I'm close on that. Income tax preparation costs Americans more than $225 billion at this time and more than 5 billion hours per year in non-productive labor. Both of those numbers are higher today as the tax code has gotten more complicated. Social woes and problems continue to escalate. Income tax laws continue to erode privacy rights. Asset forfeitures continue to rise due to inequitable monetary policy and tax laws. The American dream is quickly disappearing, and folks, it doesn't exist today. Unsound monetary and fiscal policies encourage waste and graft, and really, knowing what we all know now, it's laundered horribly amongst the politicians and their bosses. Public and private debt continue to rise. Current banking practices and policies no longer support the people but special interests, and this has gotten substantially worse. And finally, current monetary and fiscal policy provides no mechanism to stop or defeat inflation. The brains behind NESARA claims that it will fix all of these things. They say it will reduce social inequalities and problems by doubling the average standard of living. And let's talk about this. Right now, the gap between rich and poor is growing fast. I can relate to my own situation. My small Midwest town of 33,000 has a median income of 31,000 a year. I understand that prices in this town are reflected based on the income in that town, but many things can't be priced based on one's location because the prices are fixed, like medicine or insurance or vehicle prices. Those three expenses alone, especially for an older person, will suck every penny of that $31,000 a year, and that's before many of us have been able to buy groceries. The cost of living right now can be likened to a freight train that is going downhill, out of control, without brakes. They say it'll eliminate trillions of dollars of public and private debt. This would be done through mostly loan forgiveness. And I believe that this is due to the illegal methods used by those corporations, which then makes for debt owed to them to be eliminated. I believe that this is similar to if, hypothetically, ISIS invaded your town and confiscated all property and then made you pay them for your mortgage. This mortgage would be null and void. They say it will return control of the currency to the public. Now, dear listeners, this is a big one. This one act rips the chains off of the American people. This is the single most important thing that could be done to give Americans back their sovereignty. They say it will reduce the cost of using public currency. It will provide new banking rules that are equitable and fair to all. This is also a big one, and many folks don't understand much of the legislation that has been snuck through Congress over the last 30 years and what it has done to the American worker. There are and have been very reasonable ways to legislate fairness to all, but those coward lawmakers could never attempt it as they would lose their funding from their masters. They say it'll provide $500 billion of new public works projects, and folks, this is self-explanatory. This would be a necessity with America's newfound prosperity, and this number would most likely be 1 or 1.5 trillion in today's numbers. It'll replace the economic tax with a fair tax. Again, ladies and gentlemen, a no-brainer. It will improve the balance of trade problems. And folks, this is very, very simply done by doing what our forefathers did, and that is tariffs. We have been brainwashed to not even talk about the efficacy of tariffs today, and there's a reason why. Tariffs are the original, true free market system. It will rebuild American industry with high-paying, productive jobs, and this one again is self-explanatory. It will eliminate inflation, and folks, this could easily be done by setting a dollar to a precious metal price. And let's go even further, dear listeners. With regard to monetary policy, NESARA establishes 3 types of United States currency: standard silver coin, standard gold coin, and Treasury credit notes, or simply put, it restores constitutional currency. The United States Treasury buys and cancels all outstanding capital stock of the former Federal Reserve banks. The privately owned Federal Reserve System becomes a public entity, the United States Treasury Reserve System. Now, ladies and gentlemen, do you all remember the Secretary of Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, speaking at a press conference where he tells a reporter that, quote, essentially the president has merged the Fed with the U.S. Treasury, end quote. A new board of governors of the Treasury Reserve System will use a specific law-mandated plan to maintain and stabilize the exchange value of the currency. The new board assumes all powers and responsibilities of the former Federal Open Market Committee. The existing regional Federal Reserve banks become Treasury Reserve banks and continue clearinghouse operations and other bank service functions under the direction of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. All commercial banks must exchange their income-producing government obligations for Treasury credit notes. It reduces the national debt. Folks, this is in reference to how the Fed creates our money for us out of thin air and has us pay them back plus interest. It eliminates this scam. Only Treasury credit notes may be held as bank reserves. So we hold our own debt, not a group of foreign board of directors. Fundamental changes are imposed on the repayment of all outstanding fractional reserve loans on secured property. Principal must be repaid before the monetizing fee is paid. And this is neat because it makes for the principal to be paid first and whatever interest is to be paid later. A progressive federal excise tax is imposed on the privilege of making commercial loans of currency for profit. And it's about time. Next, commercial financial institutions such as credit unions are provided, subject to some restriction, with opportunities to operate with fractional reserves, so this allows credit unions more power and thus more influence in the banking sector. A good thing. Competition. With regard to fiscal policy reform, NESARA would amend the existing federal income tax system as stated. It implements a national retail sales tax upon non-exempt retail activities of commerce. There will be 21 categories of exemptions covering most necessities of life. So this means that anything deemed as necessary for life will not be taxed. The Internal Revenue Service is reorganized as the National Tax Service to administer the collection of new tax, and good riddance IRS. NESARA does not immediately do any of the following. It does not immediately eliminate all payroll taxes such as Social Security and Medicare taxes. It doesn't eliminate constitutional excise taxes on regulated activities. Now, notice it says constitutional. This means that the ones that are unconstitutional, and there are many, will be eliminated. It does not immediately eliminate the entire national debt, nor does it immediately halt inflation. Now, the reasons for this is that it is estimated that the economy will have to have some time to adjust to the switchover. These things will remain in place in some form to some degree throughout the transition period. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's dive down a little bit more into some details. NESARA will provide immediate relief and results by eliminating approximately $1 trillion of the nation's public debt. And folks, that's a decent amount back in 1998, about 20% of it at that time. Today, $1 trillion would cover about 4% of our debt. We would need about $4.5 trillion to cover that amount today. Next, it reduces future private debt by approximately $1 trillion. And again, I believe that number would have to be adjusted into today's reality. Finally, it immediately eliminates some private debt, especially for many homeowners, as discussed a little bit earlier. Now, folks, I know you've been waiting for this. What does NESARA do with regard to the foreign-owned, unconstitutional, satanic Federal Reserve? Well, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 is amended. The Federal Reserve System is abolished and replaced by a new Treasury Reserve System. Control of the currency is moved from private and foreign, I'd like to point out, control of the Fed to the public control of Congress and the new Treasury Reserve System. Now, I'd like to point out again what was said at that press conference this spring about the Treasury and the Fed merging. I still today have not been able to confirm what this meant, but when I read this, it sounded a heck of a lot what Mnuchin was heard saying on that microphone that day. He said, in other words, the federal government is nationalizing large swaths of the financial markets. The Fed is providing the money to do it. In effect, the Fed is giving the Treasury access to its printing press. Continuing. Congress sets the standards for new monetary system, but the people create as much or as little currency as they need. And folks, this is simply how the Constitution had originally directed in the first place. Functions of the Federal Open Market Committee are transferred to the Board of Governors of the new Treasury Reserve System. So transparency, finally, for our money system. And I can't believe that I actually had to say something so damned ridiculous. But when you live in a world full of sheep. Further, a new mechanism, the Treasury Reserve Account, is created to provide the Treasury Reserve System. And folks, this again sounds a lot like what Mnuchin was talking about. Board of Governors is a better method to fine-tune the money supply, effectively eliminating inflation. The Treasury Reserve System Board of Governors will continue using the previous three mechanisms for controlling the money supply. Number one, setting reserve requirements. Number two, setting the national discount rate. And number three, purchasing U.S. Treasury securities on the open market. So it looks like this Treasury Reserve System Board of Governors becomes the new operating body for our economy, setting policy. All U.S. Treasury securities purchased by the Treasury Reserve System Board of Governors will be immediately turned over to the U.S. Treasury and canceled out of existence. And that is music to any sovereign person's ears, dear listeners. Going deeper now into what the monetary policy would look like. NESARA makes it so people are provided with several alternatives for currency. Constitutional currency is restored, and currency becomes debt-free as the people stop paying interest payments for their use of a public utility, as is being done to us all right now. Continuing. Unlike previous policy, the new Treasury Reserve Board is provided one very specific mandate: maintain a stable currency. Expansion of the economy is returned to the free market. Private coinage is encouraged. Exchange ratios for the various currencies are published at least weekly. Printing of redeemable gold and silver certificates is allowed, and postal money orders are made available in denominations of gold and silver coin. All of these mentioned are really key to a strong, sovereign national economy. With regard to banking, NESARA returns the banking industry to serving public interests again. For secured loans, compound interest is outlawed, as it should be, and replaced with a monetization fee. Provides stricter banking controls by imposing excise taxes to discourage high or runaway monetization fees. On secured loans obtained from a fractional reserve bank, principal must be paid in full before the bank begins collecting its monetization fee. Now, this bullet point of the effects on banking I can't make out. I'm confused how there can still be a fractional reserve bank still operating any time after the transition is made. This point I will investigate further. Continuing. NESARA eliminates the need for banking insurance, another predatory fee that ultimately always costs the consumer. Except for fraud and criminal activities, it virtually eliminates bank failures. Banks are prohibited from using as reserves any commercial paper. Only Treasury credit notes can be used as bank reserves, allowing for better control of the system. Banks are prohibited from purchasing government-issued debt, effectively removing banks from influencing monetary policy. And this is a no-brainer. Should have been done a long time ago, folks. And finally, checking accounts against gold and silver deposits will be prohibited. Commingling of funds among the various money accounts without owner's permission is also prohibited. All currency deposits with banks are general warrant deposits and custody accounts. Now, when it comes to sales and use tax, NESARA will provide immediate results by creating a situation where workers maintain better control of their earnings, production is no longer taxed, just consumption. And folks, how does it make you feel right now to know that 30% of your sweat, tears, and even sometimes blood is snatched from you in order to pay foreign adversaries who loan our government money that we have to pay back with interest? With NESARA, most of the necessities of life are not taxed. It encourages production, thus revitalizing industry in America. With these new tax methods and spending decisions, NESARA encourages rebuilding of inner cities, discourages wasteful uses of natural resources. It exposes the cost of government, the true cost of government. Furthermore, it greatly eliminates the struggle between tax protesters and bureaucracy. It allows the underground to resurface and become a viable contribution to productions of goods and services. It greatly restricts the influence of special interests and lobbyists, and dear listeners, I'm not sure why special interest groups or lobbyists would be allowed to exist at this point, but we shall see. With regard to income tax, as mentioned earlier, under NESARA, the Income Tax Act of 1939 is amended. People need no longer fear the IRS, and many of you out there understand this all too well. Billions of hours of non-productive labor are eliminated. Mounds of paperwork are eliminated. The cost of the income tax is no longer hidden and embedded in the cost of doing business and then passed down the chain with the consumer paying the final tab, as is with most things currently. Most likely it eliminates state income tax plans because state income taxation piggybacks on federal income taxation. And so this last sentence mentioned is describing how no matter what, even with NESARA enacted, the states may continue to do certain things their way as determined by the Convention of States and the Constitution, but will not most likely continue with the illogical current income tax model. Continuing on income tax. The IRS is reformed into the National Tax Service. Volumes of complicated tax code are history. It eliminates corporate income taxes. It eliminates gift taxes and estate taxes. It eliminates capital gains taxes. And keep that capital gains tax in mind in the near future. Because on Monday, August 10th, the president announced that he is strongly considering eliminating this tax. And ladies and gentlemen, when we see what just happened with the payroll tax elimination until the end of the year per that executive order, and we talk of making it permanent next year, we start making some connections here, don't we? Alternatively, there will be a 14% sales and use tax rate. Government entities are exempt. Government mandated expenses such as licenses, permits, passports are exempt, which means, dear listeners, that the citizens will no longer have to pay for these quote-unquote privileges, as they call it. But that's not all. Any sales made by a nonprofit school is exempt. All medical goods, drugs, supplies, services, exempt. Real estate rentals or leases are exempt. Groceries exempt. Sales of livestock or fish are exempt. Certain segregated portions of labor in retail service contracts are exempt, along with incidental and occasional sales such as garage or rummage sales are exempt. Also, sales for the purposes of recycling are exempt. So for instance, that paper shredder or that cardboard box compactor will not be taxed. Meals provided by companies at company expenses are exempt. And finally, all sales that are nonprofit in nature are exempt. Now, I've seen some information out there on NESARA speaking about the release of any classified patents, cures, tech. But I believe that talk is simply folks' opinions, analysis based on some of the ancillary components of NESARA that will by default put into motion, as I did not see any language associated with that within the official proposal. But I do expect to see the release of these things. If NESARA is ever implemented, and ladies and gentlemen, if you thought a clean government and economic system is big, well, how about free energy or a cure for cancer or some other life extension technology? This video that you've just watched is most likely the deepest breakdown of NESARA. Now that we have a decent idea of what all of this entails, we can see that this act is just what the doctor ordered. This act is please excuse this poor analogy, but this act is the cancer vaccine that we have been searching for. It is the sunlight disinfectant that we all have been praying for. When Barnard wrote this act and called it draining the swamp, he knew what he was talking about. He understood the power of this act. NESARA seemingly does everything needed to cut the strings of power that the cabal, Illuminati, secret societies have held over our society. Through deceptive legislation, rogue politicians, and simply brute force, the satanic pedivore cult, used our very system against us. And when a policy or procedure couldn't be nefariously controlled, they would use a blackmail politician to force a change. NESARA changes all of this. It saves humanity, to be blunt. In today's political landscape, Donald Trump is either literally Hitler or the savior of mankind. Being awake for decades to the scams perpetrated upon humanity by these people, the left-right illusion, the divide and conquer tactics, one can never be sure either way whether someone has good intentions or not, unfortunately. Over the last 40 years, I've seen some dang good scams, some darn good acting by those in power, and I honestly believe that none of them were their own person other than Ronald Reagan. However, they were even able to get control of him a little bit after what Hinckley did to him. During this time frame, we had no champion, even though some came to us pretending to be. For me, I look at logic. I also look at a person's enemies. I saw the Republican never-Trumpers. I saw supposed Republican media and the things that they said. It was extremely out of character. I saw every establishment organization from the ACLU to the Catholic Church and the Vatican publicly come out against DJT, and my eyebrows raised. I saw the questions asked to Trump by the media and cross-reference those asked to HRC, and the difference was startling. After winning the election, we continued to see the media lie and lie and lie, to the point of looking quite juvenile, petty, and desperate. This was all unnecessary. We saw a coup in the Russian collusion scam that turned out to be a setup and is now coming to light. Logically thinking, why allow it to get this far? How many millions worldwide have awakened to this stuff that back in 2016 had no idea whatsoever that it was all occurring? What would be the point to awaken millions worldwide? It would just make pushing their platform much harder. The fake polls showed Madame winning bigly. Why not just have her win if both her and DJT are agents? Why go through all of the trouble? The Luciferians could have just installed Madame and we would have already had our nuclear exchange with Russia. China would have come in and been the mediator, pinning them as the world's only superpower, and we would have had our one world currency and government by the end of her second term. Logically, none of this extra disruption would have been necessary, and now the lingering patriots who have awakened is another problem that will, over time, metastasize. It makes no sense. And finally, when we look at Mnuchin's statements on the Fed and Treasury, and we see that December 21st, 2017 executive order on corruption, and we see the president eliminating payroll taxes for a third of the entire year and will extend it for another year if reelected. And we take note of his promise to eliminate the capital gains tax. We can see that he is actually implementing these things one by one prior to the official enacting of this act. These actions are quite telling, dear listeners. But like always, living in this hell, we must remain vigilant because things are not always what they seem. Because those secret rulers, those advisors to the kings, are damn good at what they do. However, NESARA stops them all dead in their tracks. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If so, please like, share, and subscribe. And please consider supporting this channel on Patreon. The link is in the description. Thank you.